All right, everyone, welcome back to the home office. I'm your professor, Brad Harris, and today I'm with a special guest, a friend of mine, a distinguished professor of leadership at NC State, Professor Brad Kirkman. So Brad and I have been friends, I don't know, for 12, 13 years now. We worked together at a prior institution. Brad is one of the foremost experts in organizational behavior with a specific interest on teams and leadership. Let's start from the beginning. How did you get interested in teams, Brad?
Great question. I would say it goes back a long way. I'm an only child, so didn't have a lot of experience in the family and in groups and teams. I'd been on some sports teams as a young kid, and then they kind of fascinated me. So when I was starting to work on my PhD, we had basically a class talking about individuals and how they work in organizations. But the next class I took was one on teams, groups and teams and organizations. And I found that whole subject matter to be fascinating, particularly around the concept of self-managing work teams, which was really hot in the 90s. So kind of fell in love with the whole group dynamic teams thing and decided that's where I wanted to devote my expertise.
Yeah, that's cool. So you recently published this book,
Yes.
3D Team Leadership, 2017, Stanford University Press. The first thing I think I noticed was, just how handsome this co-author was. Do you think that distracts from the book's substance at all?
I thought a lot about that. I was worried about that, and I'm sure for some people it probably did. But for the most part, I think we're okay. I think people got into the book and hopefully got a lot out of it as well.
All right. Well, thanks for playing along there. So you and I have benefited a lot from some of the people that came before us in the field. And one of those is the late, great Richard Hackman, who was at Harvard University. And we drew personally a lot from his work. And he's famous for laying out these conditions that are really good for team effectiveness. And I think we would still agree, ideally, we would want those conditions to be met, but they're getting harder to come by. What's really changed about teams these days?
Well, short answer is a lot. One of the things you and I did in the book, we created a table that basically had a column for yesterday's teams and then a column right next to it for today's teams. And we listed a whole variety or set of characteristics. And we contrasted teams from the 90s and some of the 2000s to teams today. And when I show that table to executives, people read the book and see that table, they're stunned by the fact that teams are completely different than they were in the past. I mean, from the literature on dynamism that members come and go on and off teams all the time. In the past, people were on one, maybe two teams. Leaders are leading many teams, not just one team. You've got changes in the team's lifespan. In the old days, it was long-term, ongoing, permanent teams, 2-year, 3-year teams. Now people can be on a team for a week or at the extreme, even a day. So the dynamism and the complexity of teaming, they've also gotten more virtual and more global than they ever have been in the past. And what I think you and I found in sort of reading all the books and all the literature out there was that most of the stuff that's in the popular press was written about yesterday's teams. We really couldn't find a book that was written about today's teams. So we really tried to capture that dynamism, that complexity that's much more common in today's teams. So that's really the thrust of our book was about.
All right. So another thing that we've kind of made a big deal about is this word team itself. And we distinguish a lot between groups and teams. Say a little bit about that distinction and why it actually matters.
Yeah, it matters a lot. And we kind of joke in the book that it's a bit more than semantics. I think we call everything in organizations today a team because people think that's the right way to do things. They've been taught that in school and their training that everything needs to be a team. But the fact is there are just as many groups or more as there are teams and organizations. And I think the fundamental difference that separates a group from a team is that when you have a team, you typically have a high level of what's known as interdependence. And interdependence is simply the extent of communication, coordination, integration, and collaboration required between people to get their jobs done. If you don't have a lot of interdependence in what you're working in, you probably don't have a team. You most likely have a group. A group is a set of individuals that are just brought together to maybe share information. They're not interdependent, and they're not necessarily working towards a shared goal. The reason that's fundamentally critical for managers to understand is that, say, the 10 or 12 things you would do as a leader for teams are radically different than the 10 or 12 things you would do to make a group successful. So when I talk about this with my executives, they're always kind of caught off guard by this, and they'll say things like, oh my gosh, I actually, all these years, I thought I was leading a team and actually have a group. No wonder my folks are so confused. So we teach people in the book, first of all, what the fundamental differences are between a team and a group. And number one is interdependence. And then we instruct them, once they know what they have, is it a team or is it a group, how to go about leading each of those different entities in the right way. And it's, even though we've known this notion of groups versus teams for a long time, for a lot of executives and managers, it still kind of, again, seems relatively novel to them. So a lot of aha moments and a lot of eye-opening when we talk about groups versus teams.
Yeah, so to be clear, you're not saying groups are necessarily worse than teams. You're just saying it depends.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If a task that is going on in an organization calls for people to work very closely together and be interdependent, use a team by all means. But if a task is better done by, let's say, a set of individuals working on their own relatively independently, why use a team? You should probably use a group. It's the better suited towards the task. So as Richard Hackman would have said, it's all about the task. The task sort of tells you what the best structure is to use. And so I would never say that either one of these is better than the other. They just need to be used at different times. And it's a real skill to kind of figure out, oh, this task calls for groups and this task calls for teams, and make sure that distinction is known. Then you know what to do as a leader.
So you started researching teams a little bit before I did. I won't say when because I don't want to date you, but it was in the last century. But
true, that is true.
True. But we started working together for the book. We interviewed tons of people working in teams, tons of leaders in high tech, oil and gas. We also kind of studied these really unique and fascinating emergency crews, firefighter teams that had to kind of shift between individual work, teamwork, and even sub teams. What would you say about what we learned from some of those findings?
Yeah, I think that firefighter study, really, which was the one that you led, really jump-started a lot of our thinking about this, because it was a really true representation of what we mean by 3D team leadership. And I always say, if I was in an elevator and someone leaned over and said, hey, what's your book about? Which has never happened, by the way. I'm still waiting. If I only had like 10 or 11 floors to say, I would say, well, a team is not one thing. It's actually three things. And if you're going to be an effective leader of a team, you ought to be able to lead each one of those three dimensions equally well. So number one, we always say or ask the question, is there an I in team? And most of my executives say, no, of course not, because they've heard this saying, there's no I in team. And I combat that and say, of course, there are I's in teams. There are as many I's as there are individuals. So the first dimension would be the I's. And each individual in the team needs to be coached, led, managed, motivated. Secondly, there's the team as a whole. Of course, you've got a set of individuals working interdependently towards a common task. And the team has to be led, managed, motivated in that sense. And then lastly, I think maybe a bit more innovatively, and this hasn't really been talked about a whole lot before we came along, is that a lot of teams today have little sub-teams or mini teams inside the overall team. So little subsets of team members that are kind of working together on their own task. And at some point, they're asked to bring their work together for the good of the whole team. So we do a couple of things in the book to get at that 3D model. One, we teach leaders how to lead each one of those dimensions equally well. And we found out in our research that, with thousands of leaders, that many of them are good at leading one of those dimensions. Some are good at leading two dimensions. Rarely did we find a leader who was effective at leading all three dimensions equally well. So the first thing we do in the book is make sure to do a deep dive on how to lead each one of those dimensions equally well. And the second thing is we talk about that there are times when each one of those dimensions might take precedence or be more important than the other. So there are times when leaders should focus more on the I's in their team. Likewise, there are times when leaders should focus more on the team as a whole. And then there's still other times when leaders should focus more on the sub-teams. So that's really been sort of the thrust of the book, is how to lead each one equally well. And then, you don't have infinite amounts of energy, cognitive, emotional, physical energy. You got to be able to focus and steer your energy to the right dimension of the team at the right time.
So focus is the key. That's what you're saying here.
Focus is absolutely the key. And I know when I say that, sometimes in my executives and my MBAs, they'll say, so that's the key? That's what you wrote a book about, the power of focus? Wow, thanks for wasting my time with that. And I say, well, you know, it's not just about focus. If you're asking someone or telling someone that the secret is focus, the next question they need to know or have answered is focus on what? So we take that next step in the book and say, all right, you need to focus on different dimensions, and then focus on what, when. That's the real key to the book. It's not just about focus. We don't stop there. We say, hey, not only should you focus, here are the things you should focus on. And then ultimately, you should focus on certain things more than others at different given points in time. And that is the secret. And it's sort of like working smarter, not harder, that whole saying. And so, yeah, focus is the key, but we don't stop there. We go a little bit further than that.
All right. Well, let's quickly dive in there. Let's say a leader knows that, first of all, what would tell a leader when they need to focus on what? And then what does that actually mean for that leader? I mean, what does leading an I in the team actually mean versus leading a group?
Yeah, that's a great question. So leaders need to look out for clues about which dimension would be more important. And again, we go back to the notion of, you know, the nature of the task. How is the team operating? And so if you've got more of a group situation where people are working primarily independently, they're not working collaboratively, this is really the sense of when you're focusing on the I's in your team. If you're lucky and you're leading a group that never changes and just stays a group infinitely, you can stop there. You know, you're really coaching individuals, motivating individuals. You don't need to worry so much about the team stuff or the sub-team stuff because they're not working collaboratively or collectively together. In fact, they'll probably be confused if you started spouting off all this team stuff to a group because they'll say, I don't even know you. I don't even work with you. Why are we doing this? If it's a team, if it's really a set of individuals that are working very collaboratively together, highly interdependent, really coordinating everything they do, then that takes precedence, right? So a leader would be wiser and smarter to focus on the team, set team goals, evaluate the team as a whole, give the entire team feedback, coach the team, develop the team together as an intact unit. So that'd be for highly interdependent tasks. And then lastly, if you have that more complicated structure, and believe me, my executives will tell me that my examples are too simplistic given what's going on in their organizations, but if you do have a team that's composed of a set of sub-teams working within the overall team, then you got a lot of work on your hands. Not only do you have to sort of figure out how to get the, say, 3 or 4 people in each sub-team to work effectively together, you also need to figure out how to get the sub-teams to work effectively together when they need to integrate what they're doing. Then that entire team has to deliver a product, service, solution, whatever it is, to a client or customer. So if you've got a structure like that, you've got really 3 things to focus on in the sub-team system. You've got the individuals working in each sub-team, make sure they're functioning well. The sub-teams across, make sure that's functioning well. And then make sure that entire team is delivering what the client or customer needs.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So you said before 3D even was a thing that we were talking about, and for sure before the book ever got published, you were doing research on virtual teams.
Yes.
It seems like maybe virtual teams are going to be a thing that lasts for a long time and probably going to be ramped up even more.
Sure.
And the things you're talking about work in a virtual environment?
Yeah, they can. And you know, we talk about in the book how widely applicable our 3D model is. So it can be used for stable groups and teams, but it can also be applicable to teams that follow some sort of project lifecycle model. Agile models are very popular these days. Waterfall still used in a lot of companies. So it can be used for teams that sort of change from groups to teams to sub-team systems. It can be used for all types of teams, project teams, action teams, executive teams, communities of practice. All of those entities can be led by effective 3D team leaders. We also suggested that 3D team leadership doesn't have to come from a single individual. It can come from multiple individuals in the team. So you can have shared leadership and emergent leadership. And finally, what you were getting at is 3D leadership can definitely be used in today's global virtual team settings. They're very complex. I kind of call it, when you're leading a global virtual team, you're almost leading on steroids. I mean, it's team leadership on steroids. It's going to involve you reaching out to individual members in far-flung locations, having a lot of one-on-one contact with those members. It's going to involve you making sure that that virtual team, if you have people spread out all over the world, really feel like a team. I think one of the biggest barriers or challenges for virtual teams is people don't sometimes feel like they're a part of the team. They don't feel plugged in, that sense of team cohesion. So a leader's got to work 5 times as hard as he or she would in a physical co-located type of team to get those virtual team members to feel really plugged in. And then you've got the cultural issues. So you might have 8 or 9 team members located in 8 or 9 different countries. They're bringing their different cultures together. They don't even think about teamwork or the way teams operate the same way. And so you have to get all those differences, you have to bring together, leverage those differences to create some synergy and create some good output for the team. So the model can definitely be used in a virtual team situation. And the only other issue I think that rings true for virtual teams is they can really get in a situation where the team kind of fractures along what we call fault lines. Fault lines are kind of like from geology, where the earth sort of fractures along a fault line, the earth's crust. And the same thing can happen in teams. Teams can fracture along these fault lines. One of the most common areas or reasons why they would in a virtual team, if you had, say, 3 team members in Argentina, 3 in France, and 3 in the US for a team of 9, those fault lines are pretty much gonna come along and fracture along those nationality and physical location lines. So as a leader, your challenge is really strong, because you've got to make sure that those fault lines don't form. We have a variety of things we talk about in the book about how to keep those virtual teams from fracturing along those fault lines.
Yeah, that's right. And they also, as we get bigger teams, which just seems to be a common thing as we spread out. I have a colleague here, Mary Waller, that says teams are kind of like a dinner party. Once you get past about 8 people, it's impossible to have a single conversation. So they almost naturally, you get 2 groups of 4 or whatever. I've found that helpful too. And in the book and in our exec ed, I know that we talk about, sometimes, whether it's these virtual arrangements with people spread out over the world, or the dinner party phenomenon when our teams get too big, you're going to have sub teams, whether you want to or not. So it's up to the leader to really step in and manage it and make sure you get healthy sub teams.
I agree. I wouldn't let them form on their own, because they will. And the saying, birds of a feather flock together, is true. People will tend to hang out with those that are more similar to them. And the problem with that is in teams is you want to leverage a diversity. You want that thought diversity. That's really the magic of teamwork. You're bringing people together who think very different from each other. But if they're allowed to kind of form these sub-teams and hang out with people that are like them and think the same way they do, you don't get that positive synergistic benefit of having a diverse team.
Yeah, that's good. I got a few students that sent me questions ahead of time that I want to ask some questions. These are excellent and really quite messy, so I apologize for putting you on the spot. How do feedback systems for individuals and teams differ?
So I think you can do it a variety of ways. One of the things I notice in companies is that when you're giving individual team members feedback, they seem to leave out questions that are devoted to their teamwork, right? So you're doing all individual stuff and you never ask about their interface or interactions with the team. So I think when you're designing performance appraisals and feedback systems for individuals versus teams, make sure there are elements of both individuality and teamwork across both sets. So that's something that I see. It's almost like they keep the systems totally separate, and they don't ask about individuals on the team side. They don't ask about the team on the individual side. And the other thing is really just the target of the feedback. When you're giving feedback to individuals, obviously you're focusing on their individual skills, strengths, developmental needs. When you're developing feedback systems for teams, you're talking about the collective, how the collective is operating. So in that sense, I think it's best to give feedback, team feedback to the team as a whole. I would sit them down together in a room, or it's a virtual team, get them on a conference call and talk about how the team is doing collectively. So I think it's not only the content of the system, but also the nature in which it's delivered, I think differs.
Yeah, so we use feedback for different purposes, right? One is developmental growth, but there's this other part that kind of ties into compensation and rewards.
Correct.
I think a very novice view would be like, if you want to promote teamwork, just make everything team-based. pay
Yeah.
based on team. I think it might be a little bit more complicated than that. Can you say something about that
It
phenomenon?
is one of the best examples I can think of is from Levi Strauss, the denim maker, had a fair number of sewing plants in the U.S. In the 90s, and everybody on the team was working individually, and they were getting individual base pay based on how many pairs of jeans they sewed in a particular day. And so they got enamored with this whole team thing, and they thought, well, if we want people to act like a team, we should pay them as a team. So instead of paying each individual based on how much he or she sewed that day, they put people in teams of 10, too big, too large, and they decided that they were going to count the number of jeans made at the end of the day by the entire team, and divide the money made in that by the 10 different team members. And that went over very poorly. In fact, we talk about it in our book. They had, I wish I were making this up, they had to put sheriff's deputies at the entrance to the plants to keep people from actually killing each other. They were fist fights, their verbal assaults, people just really lost their mind. And so at the end of the day, it's basically saying, yeah, there should be something in it for the team to succeed. I think team goals and team goal setting are much more powerful than talking about people's take-home pay. That is something very personal, very individualistic, particularly in the West, where the individual is the most important unit of society. So I wouldn't say ignore team motivation, but I wouldn't do it with money. I would do it more so with goal setting, or maybe a team bonus. If you want to use money, a bonus that lies outside their individual base pay.
Okay. That ties in nicely to this next question, which is extremely messy. What's the best approach for working in teams where there is a talent or skill gap? And I think what we're referring to here is not skill diversity, which could be a good thing.
Yeah.
We're talking about maybe an ability or competency deficiency from some members relative to other members. And then there's an addendum to this question. Oftentimes what occurs in this situation is that a set of people will do the majority of work, and there will be a set of individuals that free ride. How do you integrate these disparate parties?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you and I in the book talk quite a bit about the use of peer evaluations and making sure that team members have a say in the evaluation, because there is this notion of people hiding in a team or hiding even in groups and slacking off. We see it in our classes that we teach. And we also see it in the workplace. The bad news there is that the whole reason you put a team together in the first place is that you want all hands on deck. You want everybody pulling their weight. You want everybody contributing to the team. And so we talk a bit in the book about ways to lessen what we call social loafing or slacking behavior. And a variety of those. One is making sure people are accountable. And it's every leader's job to make sure that each of the team members are accountable to what they're doing. We talk about the fact that people who do jobs that are more interesting and challenging and meaningful to them actually will slack off less. So try to assign the right task to the right person to make sure they're energized and want to be a part of the task. We talk about the role of team trust. So anything you can do to build trust in a team. And the easiest example is, if I don't trust you that you're going to pull your weight, well, then why am I incentivized or motivated to pull my weight? So the fact that you can build team trust could be helpful. Goal setting is important. People respond very well to goals. So having people with meaningful goals. And then lastly, something we've talked about a little bit today is keeping the team size a bit smaller. Because what we find is that as teams grow in size, there is more and more and more slacking and social loafing. So it's a tough problem. It happens quite a bit, particularly on a team where there's no necessarily a formal leader. Like when we teach our classes, our MBAs and undergrads, there might not be a formal leader with authority. That tends to be where it happens the most. But in organizational settings, it should be a bit easier to tackle through the things we just talked about. And a leader has to play a role in that. A leader can't abdicate taking responsibility for slacking behavior.
Yeah, and we have some colleagues also doing some pretty interesting work practically and academically on team charters, after action reviews.
Absolutely.
And these mechanisms that make the feedback in real time a little bit easier so that we don't get to a spot where someone didn't even know they were free riding or they didn't understand where they were supposed to contribute.
Yeah, I think the team charter idea is fantastic. I use it with my MBAs, the full-time MBAs who are put in teams for an entire year. I have them at the very beginning, and I have them complete a team charter. and I have them physically sign the team charter, and that seems to help. Yeah, I'm a strong believer in team charters. And you also mentioned instant feedback. Yeah, don't wait a year to give someone, or even 6 months to give someone feedback that they've been a slacker. Does no good. So I think we're seeing a real sea change in the way performance management is done in organizations. It's the notion of the annual review is kind of becoming trite, and sort of laughing at that. Why wait a year? So, with the use of technology, app-based feedback, more frequent feedback is helpful, as you said, to reduce that slacking behavior.
Yeah, and the signing or some physical sign that you have bought in is really important. One of the people that helped us promote the book was Robert Cialdini at Arizona State, really famous marketing psychology professor. Yeah. And he talks about that. People are more likely to follow through on commitments when there's been some visible sign. Really good
exactly
stuff. Right. I guess I'll just leave you with an opportunity to wrap us up. Is there anything that a growth-minded leader might want to know about becoming a better 3D team leader?
I would wrap this up by sort of talking about what we talked about in chapter 9 of the book, which is, if you were to summarize maybe 5 key characteristics for what makes for a successful 3D team leader, what would they be? And when I ask my participants and executives that question, they oftentimes come up with these without having necessarily read the book in advance. So one of the ones that comes up a lot is adaptability, flexibility. Look, if you're going to be an effective 3D team leader and you're going to change your focus to fit the situation, you have to be adaptable, you have to be flexible. Related to that is something you and I coined, leader switching behavior, the ability to switch your focus from the individuals to the team to the sub-teams and back again. So it's not just being able to be flexible and adaptable more generally, it's also about, can you switch in real time your leadership behavior to match the focus, what you're trying to accomplish. We also talked about 3 was ambidextrous leadership. Again, kind of related, but a little bit different. It's the ability to kind of juggle and switch between competing priorities, right? It's the ability to really focus and prioritize on what's important at any given time. We talk about the importance of kind of creating and experimenting and being innovative, but also on the other hand, getting things done and executing. That's where the ambidexterity comes in. Emotional intelligence. Look, these are teams and they're people, and they're all going to have their individual priorities, motivations, concerns, goals, and your ability to deal with that, deal with their emotions, your emotions, have good social skills is going to be imperative. And so we know for sure that emotional intelligence is linked to effective leadership, but it becomes more imperative with team leadership since you're dealing with people who are working very closely together. They're going to have issues, and you're going to be able to deal with those. And then lastly, be authentic. Be true to yourself. That doesn't mean being an authentic leader means you can't change your behavior. It doesn't mean you can't be flexible. But when you do change your behavior, stay true to who you are. When you change your focus, those core values and principles that you bring forward as a leader have to stay. So be authentic. So that's what we would say be the 5 key characteristics for becoming an effective 3D team leader. The good news is that in the very back of the book, we have a set of diagnostic tools that leaders could use to build a 360-degree feedback instrument that will measure all the things we talked about today. And I really encourage all leaders to take advantage of that. It's in there for you. Build a 360, get some feedback, and figure out where your developmental needs are and where your strengths are.
Yeah. Brad, thank you so much for doing this. I always enjoy hearing your perspective. I feel like I learned even more today, even though I was part of this project. You did a great job. There you have it, folks. This is one of the best team leadership professors in the game. Yeah, Brad, thank you for being here. I appreciate you.
Thanks, Brad. It was my pleasure. Enjoy it.
All right.